In this section, I will focus on DMT and its neurophysiological mechanisms of action to its subsequent role in the journey of a psychedelic renaissance. Before I explore DMT, another well-known psychedelic, I would like to provide further context to the history of psychedelic substance use. As mentioned by Henri, the synthesis discovery of LSD in 1937 catapulted psychedelic substances into the interest of researchers and mainstream literature. Following several studies, preliminary results indicated that there was high potential for its use as a therapeutic treatment in mental health disorders, such as depression and substance abuse problems. This subsequently catalyzed interest in other psychedelic drugs and is credited in the literature for the growth in new research societies regarding psychedelics, most notably the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology and the American Psychological Association Psychopharmacology. However, the thalidomide tragedy in 1962 halted research progress drastically, where in response, the Drug Amendments Act of 1962 was implemented. This substantially increased regulation of drug trials in humans and marked a turning point in the demonization of psychedelics by lawmakers and political leaders. Furthermore, psychedelics were becoming associated in society with non-conventional popular culture movements, such as the hippie movement, and an underground market was seen to be the driver of emerging patterns of abuse. This subsequently encouraged pharmaceutical leaders to distance themselves from the research. Now, moving into modern day, changes in the social and political landscape have increased awareness of the potential of psychedelic drugs as treatment for psychiatric disorders. With developments in clinical research approaches and advancements in understanding the drug-brain interactions, there's movement towards recognition of psychedelics as budding treatments for a range of psychiatric disorders and age-related diseases. Particularly in this current day, when there's abundant public health need for this is of huge significance. Considering this, perhaps this marks the next turning point in the positive recharacterization of psychedelics for lawmakers and medical researchers, perhaps the psychedelic renaissance. Moving on from LSD, this section will focus upon another psychedelic, DMT. DMT is chemically named as N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and is a psychedelic compound that is found in botanical sources such as the Psychotria viridis vine, as well as being produced endogenously by mammals. Structurally, DMT is small as well as hydrophobic. These two characteristics in combination allow it to easily cross the blood-brain barrier. Consequently, it can cause intense hallucinogenic effects in vitro in humans. However, at lower doses, there is indications that it has mood-lifting and calming effects. Furthermore, it is structurally similar to melatonin as well as its precursor, the neurotransmitter serotonin, whereby each acquires a tryptamine core. This can be seen in Figure 2, where coinciding structures are shown in red. It is also structurally alike to other serotonergic psychedelics such as LSD. As mentioned previously, as it can cross the blood-brain barrier, DMT can interact with several receptors such as the serotonin receptors, also known as 5-HT. It has affinities to bind with the 5-HT receptors. Recent research suggests that the majority of the biological effects seen by DMT are moderated by its action to the 5-HT2A receptor, for example, in its involvement in visual hallucinations. The most well understood mechanism of action is to the 5-HT2A receptors. This is a G-coupled protein receptor and is located across the mammalian brain, for example, in the cortex and hippocampus. Activation of this receptor is known to be an essential component in the mechanism of action for the classic effects seen with other psychedelics, such as LSD and psilocybin, which either act as full or partial agonists. Current research suggests that DMT also works via the same pathway and is an agonist of the 5-HT2A receptors, causing the G protein alpha and beta gamma subunits to dissociate. This consequently activates phospholipase C, the primary second messenger signaling pathway for the 5-HT2A receptors, whereby diacylglycerol and inositol triphosphate are released, stimulating protein kinase C and therefore calcium release. Previous research was conflicted with this hypothesis, with an in vivo experiment suggesting that DMT acts as an antagonist rather than an agonist. However, A later in vitro study, which used recombinant cell lines, showed results that DMT did act as an agonist and furthermore produced a maximum response in the phosphoinositide hydrolysis assays, implying that phospholipase C was activated. It can be argued that the earlier study was likely to be more representative of the mammalian brain, and this study is limited by the fact it was done in vitro. Therefore, the cloned receptors would not reflect the properties of an in vivo drug receptor interaction. However, the researchers then carried out a receptor agonist-antagonist drug discrimination paradigm with rats to evaluate the mechanisms of DMT in vivo, which confirmed that DMT does function as a 5-HT2A agonist. This method has previously been proven to be an effective evaluative method, further supporting the agonistic model of action. Recent studies have revealed the potential therapeutic uses of DMT. Historically, DMT consumption has been associated with ayahuasca, a traditional drink consumed in South America for spiritual and recreational purposes. In fact, DMT is the main compound found in it. A study in 2005 investigated the effects of the use of ayahuasca on symptoms of anxiety and depression in a sample of members of 2 religious organizations. This was done via an evaluation of baseline mood over a short-term period, 7 to 14 days after ritual of ayahuasca. Reductions were reported in symptoms of both anxiety and depression, supporting the therapeutic use of DMT. However, it is important to consider that the religious context of a sample could have compromised results, as there is evidence that religious engagement often accompanies happier well-being. Despite this, 2 later studies which did not sample from a religious group both reported statistically significant reductions in depressive scores after a single dose of ayahuasca over a 21-day report. Furthermore, no episodes of mania were reported. These studies provide preliminary evidence for the therapeutic potential of DMT consumption. Future research should investigate the effects over a longer period, as all 3 studies were conducted short-term. It's interesting to review the theories behind the mechanisms underlying positive mental health changes throughout DMT consumption. Traditionally, this has been attributed to both the underlying physiological mechanisms and more recently the psychological experience. A plethora of studies have supported the physiological mechanisms view. More recently, support for the psychological experience has grown, with a review in 2021 of 20 studies investigating the response to psychedelics in patients with mental health disorders, concluding that the experience of psychedelic effects is essential for successful therapeutic response. For example, in 2 studies, those with higher ratings of ego dissolution were found to have stronger long-term improvements in mental well-being. It is probable to comment that these 2 factors are likely not to be mutually exclusive. Furthermore, it is interesting that recent studies mention decoupling the subjective effects of psychedelics through chemical design. For example, a 2021 study discusses an engineered prototype of a non-hallucinogenic substance, which is an analogue of 5-MeO-DMT. Does this suggest that an underlying stigma still remains towards the psychological experience? To conclude, as modern research ethics continue, the evidence from studies published set precedents for perhaps the next turning point in psychedelic history, towards renewed interest in their therapeutic potential. So far, this is based on preliminary evidence, and future research should encompass longer-term studies with larger sample sizes. For DMT, this is predominantly seen in the form of treatment for an increasing prevalence of mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression. However, despite progress in accepting psychedelics as useful tools rather than social threats, it's crucial to reflect on the extent to which a stigma persists and to ask how damaging this is for medical advancement. Thank you for listening.